Hello everyone. Today is my first video on a mini-series I'm going to be doing on the EU electricity grid. Today I'm going to be focusing about the problem with renewables. So I'm going to be going over what is grid following and why it's a problem, the energy cost curve and why it's important, and why natural gas is currently a necessary evil. This is an article that came out in 2019 titled "The Day Europe's Power Grid Came Close to a Massive Blackout." So frequency nominally set at 50 reached almost 50.6 and caused a massive outage in a big part of Europe. Reading down here, we see spinning turbines of thermal plants connected to the grid create kinetic energy called inertia, which helps keep the network at the right frequency. This spinning can't be created by wind turbines or solar panels. So I'm going to be going over why that's the case. So this over here is an inverter. It is essentially the device that connects something like a solar panel to the grid. There's two types of inverters. There's a grid following or a grid forming. A grid following, as the name suggests, essentially synchronizes to the system voltage and frequency and gives power according to it. So if the frequency goes higher, the grid following inverter will see that and actually provide more energy to the system. Whereas what you need is something that will provide less energy such that it can get it back to 50. A grid forming inverter is essentially that. It is a device that partially mimics certain attributes of a synchronous generator, which is what it talks about here in terms of the spinning turbines. However, currently in the EU, grid following inverters are basically 99%, and grid formings are practically non-existent. So why is there no more grid forming? There's a higher cost for this adaptive inverter, usually around 10% to the entire cost of the plant. So significant, but nothing crazy. I think the biggest one is that there's currently no real incentive for someone to provide less electricity, especially if the marginal cost of production of electricity for a solar plant is zero because it is already set up. It doesn't cost any more to provide more energy. So there's no real reason anybody would want to sell more than he can produce at any point in time. Finally, grid issues are a very recent problem. So even just looking 10 years ago, we don't see that much solar in the market, and therefore this essentially called a duck curve, which happened due to the rise in solar, it is more of a recent phenomenon. So why I believe grid forming will become very popular is grid issues will probably make them mandatory, or they'll find a way to incentivize people to use it. It will become cheaper as their supply chain ramps up. And finally, they will be able to participate in auctions other than the day-ahead auction. So what are these auctions? So the way the electricity price in Europe is actually set is through these different types of auctions. The biggest one being the day-ahead auction. So it closes the day before and essentially says what are going to be the biggest suppliers of energy on the next day. However, as supply and demand can't be completely forecasted, there are other auctions such as the intraday or the balancing energy, which are smaller auctions for a smaller volume of electricity that can be used to balance out energy throughout the day. So this is what an electricity auction cost curve looks like in terms of marginal cost. We see solar and wind at practically zero, nuclear, then hydro, coal, and finally gas. So the price of electricity is actually set by the variable operating cost of the last and most expensive generator needed to meet demand. So what does this mean? It means that if demand is here, the price of all electricity will be set by gas, whereas if demand is here, the price of all electricity will be set by coal. However, the system is not as simple as this curve might make it seem. In a world of unpredictable supply and demand, there is a large need of something called a load balancing source. So here are examples of some non-load balancing sources. That is solar, wind, because of the grid following architecture, and nuclear, because it takes longer than a day to ramp up or ramp down production. Some examples of load balancing sources are battery, hydro, gas, biomass, or coal. we see battery and hydro are actually the fastest ramp up or ramp down, followed by gas, and finally coal. So given that battery storage isn't really out there yet, and given that only some countries have hydro reservoirs, they're essentially forced to use gas as the load balancing source. Coal can be used, but 3 to 6 hours. It can probably only be used for some parts of the intraday market, probably none of the others. So using gas is of high importance. Looking at the day ahead auction of many different countries in the EU, I've practically split them into 3 cost groups. There is the low cost, which is Sweden and Norway, with a price of 20 to 40, where the marginal price setter is usually hydro or geothermal. Mid costs, I've put France, where the marginal price setter is nuclear. And finally, high cost is anything above 80 plus, where the marginal price setter is gas. So that seems to be pretty much most of the countries in EU. So if you're a country in the EU and you want to reduce gas prices, the number 1 priority should be to remove gas as the marginal price setter of the day ahead market. So why don't they try to do that? Looking at just yesterday's day ahead market in Germany, we see that 75% of the day we see negative or zero prices for energy. So looking at it a bit more in detail, we see in Germany about 60% of electricity is renewable. And that leads to more than 500 plus hours, which is 6% of all the hours in a year, of negative or zero prices. France only has a 27% renewable share, but also has a 67% nuclear share, and it also sees about 350 hours in a year of negative prices. So while nuclear is non-adjustable, at least it is predictable. So that's probably why France is not as bad as Germany. However, Germany probably drags down France. So what do I mean by that? So since the countries are linked, if Germany has a problem of oversupply, it sells energy to France, which can also cause a problem in France. So further increasing the renewable share will further increase the negative prices duration, which is not something any of the countries wants, because negative prices significantly reduce margins of power plants. So finally, what does this mean? I've put down here a graph of natural gas prices in EU. All the way up to 2021, there wasn't really anything to see here. However, after the war between Ukraine and Russia started, we saw this massive spike in natural gas, which, given that most countries in the EU are forced to have natural gas as the marginal price setter within the country, basically also saw a massive increase in energy prices. While the energy later normalized as they were able to find sources from different places, the recent events in Iran, we see another big spike in natural gas. And while it hasn't spiked much yet, if it were to continue, I don't doubt that we might see something similar to the events of 2022 happening again. So that's what I'm going to be talking about next video. So concluding today's video, renewables can only be scaled further by incentivizing them to become load balancers. Nuclear is a huge structural advantage for a country going forward, and the current grid is starting to become a mess. Further restructuring is required to further develop the grid. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed today's video.